Hello and welcome back to the headquarters here at OEC for our almost final session. And I'm very happy that we have Ben Cerveny with us here today. He is the co-founder and president of the Foundation for Public Code. And without further ado, he will give a keynote talk about what happens when software becomes public infrastructure and how we can manage, or how cities and communities can manage software then in an open manner. Ben, it's great to have you here, and over to you.
Hi, Leah. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone at OESC for the invite to participate in this conference. Thank you, Martin. And I'm going to try and start some screen sharing video here. It usually takes a minute to get its act together. Please let me know when you can see it.
Yes,
Okay, great. This is just an incredibly important moment in this sort of transformation of the public sector. Obviously, we are facing, something that's never happened before, really, which is the total kind of transformation of the operation of governance into a digital process, not on purpose. Unfortunately, this time it was just a movement through the COVID crisis into a new form of relating to each other as public servants and politicians, but also with our citizens. And this transformation happened at scale of society and almost instantaneously. And so what that meant was that we had parliaments convening on Zoom, civil services operating almost entirely out of Microsoft Teams, and this all happened, within a matter of days or weeks as people sort of had to flee their offices for fear of infection. So we're just now, I think, beginning to metabolize the ramifications of some of this change. But I think that really the first thing that almost everyone, we at the Foundation for Public Code have been for a number of years now talking to public organizations about digital transformation and how important it is that they sort of take agency in this process for themselves and begin to sort of understand what their role will be in the future of sort of a software-driven process within government. But there is sort of this core threshold, this core moment that we go across, which happens all the time in cycles of technological development in society, which is when things that we call technology, humans invent things all the time. For the first 30 years or so, we call them technology. And if they work, then we call them infrastructure. And this has happened, of course, with electrification and, plumbing and all these things that we sort of have metabolized as society. And for a while, we sort of understood them as this thing that was out in front of us and different and new and had to be confronted. And then we sort of metabolized them and they became things that we didn't really think about at all anymore. And those things we call infrastructure for the most part. Well, most people don't think about them except for the people that run this infrastructure, which is often public organizations. And so the thing that we're now experiencing as this very software that we're using to collaborate in these distanced times is actually core infrastructure now, and we have to recognize that, and we have to sort of understand what that means for the operation of government and for the participation of citizens in this government. So one of the things that is really interesting about this moment, this sort of criticality of the transformation of technology into infrastructure, is that cities have always been the crucible in which this transformation happens. Cities are, first of all, one of the longest running processes, continuously running processes that humans have created, which is really important when you start to think about this idea of sustainability of its organizational infrastructure, because a city really basically is a continuous organizational infrastructure that we're all inhabiting. And it turns out that software is also becoming that. And so the question is, what happens as those two giant systems for organizational infrastructure converge? And we need to very much manage that process consciously. And so one of the tools that, of course, cities use and governments in general use to turn technology infrastructure and sort of the core kind of process of this metabolization that I was talking about is through the iterative generation of policy. The idea is that, there is a code base, and this is part of the reason why our organization is named the way it is, the Foundation for Public Code. Public is both something that is open and also something that is civic, and code is both something that is a policy and something that is software. and those things are actually overlapping more and more as we go. And so what we need to make sure we're doing as we begin to implement more and more software code in our government model is to realize that that is going to be entirely entangled with policy code. That is the way that we have run government until now, or until several years ago when we started this process. And so policy is something, much again, like software, both of these things define possibility spaces. They define rule sets in which operations take place. That is both something that happens in society and something that happens in applications of software. And so this is what we call the stack of both the policy and the software living together is public code. So some of the things that have been made civic and public through policy processes are, of course, rights, property, industry, trade, transportation. These are things that now, again, in the same way that technology has been something we take for granted, the policy surrounding many of these activities, although sometimes contested on its borders, is by and large considered an assumption of the baseline of what society provides for its citizens. So where are we at right now in digital society in this transformation? This inflection point again has accelerated some of these issues, but really, we have this problem where, we want to get to the digital society, but we have some kind of stoppers. One is that, policymakers, of course, although they're trying to do the right thing, technology, there's this famous Stewart Brand diagram that describes how fast things are moving in the world, and policy is moving at a very slow speed because it is trying to be inclusive. It's trying to be, to find consensus with a huge number of actors. It's trying to do the best thing for everybody. And of course, software famously is disruptive, move fast and break things, et cetera. These are the approaches that software development has had. And so part of the problem with that is that policymakers don't really know what the capabilities of software are, what the constraints of software should be, what the processes of its ideal development are. And so, this has been one big stopper in the sort of development of an agile and open digital society. And then the next sort of phase of that is, in the context of this uninformedness, a lot of software providers have taken advantage of that by stepping in with proprietary and closed systems, which often extract value and extract agency from the systems that they operate in. So the idea that, parking services or waste management services or library systems or even, citizen identification systems might be operated by a third party in ways that the city doesn't understand means that they no longer have the ability to fully account for what their choices are to their residents, and they also don't have the ability to potentially make all the changes they need to if they're staying adaptively accountable to the needs that are moved through their policy making bodies. If they make changes to their policy, then they need to be able to have the ability to affect those changes in the software that represents that policy. And that in general is what's happening in this digital transformation, is that policy is implemented as software. And if you implement policy as software, there has to be a feedback loop that connects the evaluation of the software's ability to provide what the policy claims it's going to. And so, these are the sorts of issues that we're sort of confronted with. Probably the primary one is that the proprietariness of these code bases means that that public servants and the other actors that are operating in the space, a vendor ecosystem of people that are trying to make incremental changes to software to respond to policy needs, don't necessarily have that access because the proprietary code bases have closed off access to transformation. You can request that, and often in response you get a giant assessment fee, that's going to be part of the transformation process from the provider, and you have no choice there because it's their tool that you're locked into. And so lock-in in general and licensing fees that accompany that lock-in have become part of this sort of pipeline of extraction that is almost taken for granted both by the vendors and the cities at this point. But it's not just about this it's not an adversarial relationship necessarily. It's just a question of making sure that cities sort of recognize their role in this sort of agency of making sure that the architecture of these systems is theirs to control. So it's about stepping up. So the idea that a city needs to evolve the capabilities to become technologically sovereign in the sense that they actually have the agency and the control that is necessary in order to respond to democratically sort of directed policy changes, and that those policy changes then are reflected in the code bases that are implementing them. And so, one of the things I often say about, software is that it has terroir, which is a word from the winemaking trade, which means that software is a product of its local environment. And that's something that we really haven't discussed in the software industry. A lot of times when you think about things like, French cuisine, Italian cinema, whatever it is, these things are what they are because they are situated culturally, and they bear the mark of the crafts and sort of contextual sort of ideologies and approaches that have crafted them. However, software, as it is told right now through the sort of global software industry, is totally without context. It is just presented as cloud. It comes from the cloud. Where is that? No one knows. But what that means is that the decisions that are baked into software, software essentially is a lot of decisions that have been baked into a process. And so, if those decisions have come from a culture far away that doesn't share the concerns of the implementing culture, then there's going to be a mismatch as to what the software's implementation does relative to the policy and the cultural context that the software is operating in. So with open code bases, you have the ability to go in and fork or transform the software that you take from the common repository, which is sort of the global application. In the same way that a cloud application would be global, you do have a global repository, but then you can decide for yourself whether you want to fork that system and provide new ways of access, new kind of cultural context and policy context based on what your needs are within the local public organization. So in the end, the public software must reflect the values of the society that it serves. And so in order to do that, you have to be able to transform it for that. So I mentioned this before, but the software and policy together are what makes public code. So the idea is that in any kind of piece of public code that's put on offer by our foundation or others, the idea is that you would have both a repository of functional code that you could launch as a service that your system offers to its own public service or to its citizens, but also that you would have a policy white paper that describes what the effect will be on your policy system based on the launch of this piece of software. And you need to make sure, in order to bring all of the stakeholders to the table in a way that they understand what functionality and what sort of procedural changes are being made to the code on both the policy side and the software side, you have to have a way to integrate those stakeholders at the table. And public code provides a process and a set of materials that can help this kind of cohesion maintain. And so, of course, this isn't something that's brand new. A lot of cities have already, many cities that we've collaborated with already, like Amsterdam and Barcelona, have already, moved forward in the process of developing for themselves digital tools that help them run their infrastructure. Many of the code bases that we're looking at right now to help steward and scale and share between municipalities are developed in the context of a realization that cities have been possibly taken advantage of by proprietary vendors, or the vendors don't actually provide solutions that the cities need exactly. And so they realize that they need to take on some agency of their own and begin to craft solutions. And doing that in open source is the first step towards making something that can scale and be collaborated on, because that critical issue of being open source means that you do have this non-proprietary way of looking at the code, transforming the code, working with it, and offering it back up to collaborative partners. And that's a huge part of what this process offers as an acceleration and a sort of a risk diffusion for all the people working in the process together. So some of the things that are already being sort of developed by various municipalities in this way are transit solutions, school management solutions, healthcare, sharing, libraries. All of these things are just they've become almost sort of the greatest hits of thinking about what digital infrastructure for cities could be like. But now we're seeing, a real sort of groundswell of understanding that it might really be useful to have these tools as open infrastructure, because then they become collaborative. But the thing that happens on top of that open infrastructure is this making of it as public code, and that requires another sort of layer of process, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And so, these code bases that are all, going to serve as, core ways that we digitally transform our cities and states and possibly national governments, they really serve in a couple of really, critical ways to enable and empower the administrations that are operating. And first of all, part of the problem that one runs across in trying to shift away from proprietary code bases to open code bases is that there is risk there, and what we really need to do is build an infrastructure that allows for that risk to be diffused across a number of actors. And that's why open source is so powerful in this way, is because it brings people through a community into a group of actors that share the need for the software, and so they can collaborate on a lot of different issues. This also accelerates, of course, by adding resources across the collaborators, and it pushes back against the cost of licensing. So the foundation serves as a way to kind of frame this activity of collaboration on open source products in the context of the public sector by producing public code bases. And we do that through this process we call code-based stewardship, which is, in the same way that I was saying that cities are an ongoing process, the thing that a lot of public administrations haven't realized in the way that they treat software procurement, because of course they've come from a time where software in the minds of a lot of public servants is still in this category. There's an acronym that gets used in Europe, which is ICT, and the minute I hear this acronym, it means that people are still often thinking about IT in the way of like, oh, these are the people in the basement next to the maintenance facilities office that plug the Ethernet into the back of the computer. But of course, while they're thinking that, Google knows more about their city than they do. So they sort of, the mindset is like slowly shifting around, who needs to, how we need to approach this headspace. So probably the most important tool that the foundation has evolved to help cities sort of begin to understand how they can collaborate and participate in this process is a document we've called the Standard for Public Code. And this document serves much like other kind of certification documents. It is a set of criteria which one can use to evaluate a code base to see whether it is something that can be shared by other organizations. Because often, as cities have developed solutions for themselves to fix problems that they see in their own operation, and they've done that in open source even, maybe that the code base is open, but the problem is that a lot of times there is no, unless you consciously are thinking about the idea that this code is going to be shared by others, you don't approach the development process in a way that leaves something behind that is usable by others. And so really what this standard is about a set of criteria that you can be mindful of as you're developing or as you're refactoring in preparation to make a piece of software open or to turn it into a public code base. You can understand how you need to present this material in a way, or continuously develop this material in a way that is accessible to everyone. So the idea that you use version control and that you use it's all well documented. These types of things that seem very straightforward. Often, if you're in a situation where you're rushing to develop a solution, especially if it's an emergency situation like these, contact tracing applications that were just built, pell-mell kind of by multiple different national scale organizations. Like a lot of times, the problem is if you hire a vendor to do that, even if it's open source, if they're not leaving this wake of like sort of context behind them as they go, then when someone returns to try and pick it up again, no one will understand, no one will be able to approach it, the vendors may be gone, and it becomes a huge onus to bear. And that's where, some people, when they come to that point in the arc of public software, open software development, they think to themselves, maybe we should have gone with some sort of proprietary solution because they would still be there for us. But part of the foundation's role is to serve as this entity that can help collaborators form a sustainable partnership that is ongoing. And this is really, I think, the point about open source in general, is that open source is people. open source is a process of development that brings people to the table that generate a code base. And much like the city is not, the city is a process. The city is not a set of buildings, because cities, have been, London is not the same buildings it was when it began, but it's still London. Similarly, these applications are not the same code bases they were when they began, but they are the same applications because they solve the same problem. And so what you really want to be able to do is build a community of participants, both vendors and public organizations and, sort of mediating actors like ourselves, that can create a continuous structure that allows for sustainable development, sustainable governance, a sustainable steering technically of the organization. And the sort of foundation, so to speak, of that whole process is the implementation of the standard. If code bases can support the standard, can comply with the standard, then they already are ready to serve as shareable applications between actors. And so it creates a whole ecosystem of potential code bases that people can reach out to each other, that organizations can reach out to each other with their common needs and say, hey, let's collaborate on this. And they can then both bring their technical resources up to the standard and work on that together. So I want to talk just very briefly about the other parts of stewardship. I know I have limited time here, but stewardship is really a concept that I think we're going to see a lot more of, not just in the context of public code, but in general. This process of tending collaborative public development of resources is, I think, critical. And for us in code-based stewardship for public code, we've realized that there are sort of 4 threads that we're emphasizing. I think there are maybe some others that will be, sort of emerging in the next iteration. But initially, we talk a lot about, community development is already what I've spoken about, which is that there is, the actual software, public code is people. And so identifying the actors within public organizations that will collaborate with each other on developing these tools is super important. But the idea that, the foundation can help provide many of these resources, including things like Mattermost and Jitsi and GitHub and like these kind of pieces of cloud software that we've realized are part of the open stack of creating a community, on the internet that provides real-time feedback and collaboration. But also a lot of this involves just making sure that these people know each other and understand the context that they're coming from, and sort of iteratively working through a process of governance and steering of the code bases as they go forward. With, obviously product management plays a huge role as well, in the sense that not so much from a commercial product management perspective, but sort of even in this way, like I said, when you're developing an open source solution for your own city, you don't really think about how to contextualize that for another actor. What is it about this tool that they're going to use? How will they understand the value of this? How will they actually open it up, unbox it, as we like to say? What is the process of spinning this up in a different cloud than the one that you natively operate in? And sort of spending a little time thinking about that, interestingly, improves not only another organization's ability to adopt your software, but also your own ability to make something flexible enough for your future needs, because maybe your own organization will look more like one of these other organizations that's trying to replicate it in the future. So by thinking about these issues, you create something that's a little bit more agile and adaptive. Support in this context is an interesting one, because it's really about the procurement process and the vendor relationship. So what does, if right now software services in the public sector are dominated by proprietary cloud-based companies, what does a shift in the whole ecosystem towards having more distributed and local, smaller software companies that can take a procurement from a local government and use that, to adapt to one of these larger public code applications that is used by many municipalities for their local environment. And so the idea is, how do you build a process and an educational stream that brings vendors up to speed on the opportunity of participating in a public code ecosystem and the process, and potentially provides a context for introduction between vendors and cities. And so, I would say probably the thing that's the core issue around what the value is that operating in this way provides is we're really, the transformation that's happened in the private sector, the big cloud platform companies have achieved their success not just because of savvy marketing and algorithms that help them create positive feedback with their users and some other insidious stuff, but they really do have like a back end transformation that they have gone through, which has been a productive explosion, akin to the Industrial Revolution. And there are a couple of tools on the back end of coding for these companies like Google and Facebook that they have utilized in such a way that they have multiplied by tens of thousands the productivity of software companies that came before. And those two tools are version control and continuous integration. And version control basically just means you can have thousands of copies of the same piece of code, which is interesting also, by the way, to think about code both in this case as software and as policy, because we believe that this type of tool will probably come in quite handy in the way that policy becomes more rapidly adaptive as well. But version control is something that allows you to fork this, everyone downloads their own version of the software or code base that generates the software and then works on it. And then there's a managed system that allows everyone to resolve any conflicts between the changes that were made at the far end. And so what that means is, sort of like the Industrial Revolution created the production line, the version control creates thousands of production lines that then reconverge at the end. And that reconvergence has one phase, which is the merge process within version control. And then the next phase, which is what we call continuous integration, which is the idea that, it used to be that softwares had very discrete versions that, you have to now go and download, the new version of Microsoft Word and install it, and it uninstalls the previous version and things break and everything's weird and you have to figure it out again. Whereas continuous integration is a process, that basically results in the type of experience that you might see on a Google Cloud interface, where changes are slowly being introduced because they're being merged back into the code base, but it's not a huge jump. It's just something that is like a slow evolutionary process, and that is really something that allows for much more agile adaptation of software solutions, because they're just slowly changing to meet the needs without being completely blown apart and put back together again. And so this kind of fluid mechanism for both, managing a huge collaborative process across multiple cities, and then taking that into something that then can be redeployed into many different implementations that are running in many different places seamlessly, is, potentially creates a very different type of ecosystem for the operation of public software. So I wanted to go really quickly through kind of a hypothetical example of what version control and continuous integration would look like. So let's hypothetically say that Amsterdam has built a traffic management system that they really love in open source. They brought it up to the standard. So it turns out that Barcelona has a need for this type of tool, and so that they actually they download an instance of this code base into their local system, and then they start making some changes. They of course need more languages added. They realize that they need to make a templating system for how you would make things more than one language. And so the interesting part about version control is that now, rather than having taken that away and said, bye, we made some changes, instead they can now offer that back up into the central system. Hey, we made some changes there. It's about being bilingual. Maybe you'd want to accept that back into the core code base. Let's say that Brussels now, because of the bilingualness, is like, hey, we can also now use this system. So they download it and they decide that they want to add an air quality feedback loop to that. And so they go out and get a separate procurement, and that procurement abides by, with a vendor that's already had some education on what it means to participate in an ecosystem like this. So they can work with vendors in other cities that are also working on public code bases. They comply with the standard of public code, and they make some changes, they add some components, and that can be easily recontributed. And then of course, it goes back to Barcelona, and then finally all the way back, because everybody is using the same code base, the same version control system, and that flow of adaptivity harnesses a distributed and collaborative set of resources that involve public-private ecosystems, actors within the government, actors in the private sector, and then these frameworks that the foundation helps set up, like governance committees and steering committees and repositories and community systems that allow for this whole this whole system to function with a metabolism that keeps it alive and moving forward as a process. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I know that was quite a sort of fast tour through a lot of information, but I'm around for questions, and of course my colleagues are going to be available later on, and we have some other announcements to make just after this. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ben, for this really, really great presentation, for all the insights that you shared. I think what you're doing at the Foundation for Public Code is really what many cities are now looking to. How can we share what we're producing ourselves? How can we share the software, and how can we together improve it? So this is really something fundamental in going forward. And you mentioned the standard for public code, Ben, and I'm so excited that we are, and thanks really to you guys at the Foundation for Public Code. We have launched just now our City by City Academy with the first public code open online course. And it's now basically open to register for everyone. You can just go on the website. You can select under our courses that you're just seeing on the website the introduction to the standard for public code. You can enroll for free, and you can explore the different parts that make up the standard for public code. And you can also see who's behind it. So the different code base steward that you mentioned, Ben, are giving the introductions to the different standards. So yeah, I just invite everyone to go there, explore it, and if you find a bug, let us know. We're open and agile, right? The email address is also on the website, so if you find something that doesn't work, let us know and we'll fix it.
Yeah, we're really excited to share this, and yeah, definitely welcome your feedback. It's definitely an iterative process, so we're going to be evolving this as we go. But I do think that this will very much serve as an introduction to thinking about how one could approach implementing the standard for public code on code bases that you're working with in your own organizations, or also what to expect, if you're going to try and participate in a collaboration process that already is using public code. You can sort of see what the criteria are for how we all operate together.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for being our guinea pig. So this is the inaugural course on the CITYxCITY Academy. Of course, more will be coming up among the topics, the fair AI and so on that we've been discussing. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.